With the long throw, Cork waiting on the edge of the 6-yard area, and in scores! Seconds when the ball went in the net. They were looking for Cork on the near edge of the 6-yard area, no marking on Deane, and Sheffield United had the start they were looking for. Comes in, nobody goes with him until
Hello everyone, welcome back. It's been a while. Delighted to say we're back at Bramall Lane for the next instalment of one of our own podcasts where we talk to players past and present about their time at Bramall Lane. And the person we've got here today literally needs no introduction. So good, Sheffield United signed him not once, not twice, but 3 times. He is a genuine Sheffield United legend, a hero to many. It's Brian Deane. Good to see you.
How you doing?
Are you well?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm cool. You know, we're in certainly a different state of affairs, but everybody's coping as well as they can, and I'm no different.
How do you feel when you come back here to Bramall Lane? What emotions do you go through every time you walk through the door?
Yeah, I mean it's changed obviously. I've kind of when I came back as a player. Obviously I got this real kind of excitement and, this real feeling of anxiety and, all of those kind of instincts came back to me. I think in later years as I've come back, I kind of look a little bit more, holistically about what's going on, how the club is structured and all the rest of it. I perhaps... I don't know what it is, but perhaps I pay a little less attention to the kind of actual football side. Although I do enjoy watching the games, that's like the cherry on the top. But because I've managed myself and been abroad and I have my own ideas, I kind of try and sort of like I always go with what's the short, medium, long term thought process going on. I've been in the lounge and I kind of look at the kind of body language of people, and I think where's the club going, where are they, and I'm looking at how everything's done, and I'm thinking, okay, well, what are they setting up for, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
It's and I think that's come from being at several clubs, seeing how they developed. When I went to Sarpsborg, I had the interview, and one of the things that they wanted is they wanted to change the image of the club. They wanted to be more professional. They wanted to kind of start looking further than just the next season. Staying in the division. It was about becoming more professional, and from my point of view, what I then did was kind of tapped into all my experiences with all the people that I played under, what happened in certain stages at different clubs, how they've developed since I've left there. And then, onto my, what my life is like now, and those kind of thoughts. Because, I'm so far away from being a player now that, it's pointless me talking about putting my boots on and so on. It's about, what value are people bringing into every situation, and that's not to be critical of anybody. It's just I'm talking about my development and where I feel that maybe I should be, or where I want to be, or how I want to contribute to any given situation in my life.
And when you look back at your career, how proud are you of what you managed to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, it's still... Look, I mean, I was just a kid in Leeds growing up, and I used to get Roy of the Rovers like everybody else, and they had this picture at the back saying, "Sign, please."
Yeah.
And, there'd be a footballer usually been knelt on the floor, and the thought was eventually you go and see it. And I've seen it, and I've been on a couple of things like Shoot, from when I was younger, and it was always about I want to be that person, So to come from that to actually go through what I've been through, and I look back and there's certain things about my career I look at and I think, wow, that it doesn't feel like me. It's almost like an out-of-body experience at times. There was times where I was down here celebrating in front of the Kop, and I'd look into the crowd and I'd have my hands up, and I'd be looking at people and they're looking at me and I'm thinking, really, is this me? It's like somebody's transported my body onto the pitch, and it's somebody else, and I'm sort of like hovering down, looking at what's going in. It's really surreal. But yeah, I'm very proud. It's always gone too quickly. We talked off air about some of the things like the video that the Brian Deane story from when I first came, and to think how much time has gone. We're getting old, and the one thing with me is that I think time's so precious now, because I think when I was down here, my parents were my age now, and I've just lost my mum, for example. So all of those things are like, in another 30 years, do you know what I mean? You've got to make the most of the time now. And it's hard to say that to the younger generation because they're in the middle of something that they don't really understand. But, actually kind of making the most of every opportunity is so important. When I left here, and I remember, myself and Craig Short got man of the match, it was like a symbolic thing. And I remember walking down the stairs down behind, and the door shut, and it was a case of, that's it, you're done. I was 38, and it's like, that's it. Your life changes because people look at you differently now. You're no longer a footballer, or you're no longer, it's the next, on to the next thing. Yeah. So, yeah, I had great times looking back. I decided I was going to start saving all my shirts. So I've started doing that because my boy's only young. And, he's not going to know that I used to play football and so on. So I've got to try and leave some kind of pathway for him to follow in terms of understanding who I was and what I did.
This podcast will take weird and wonderful turns. You mentioned shirts, and fans always talk about shirts. Mm-hmm. The one that I really like that you played in, and I'm sure you will probably tell me it was your favourite, maybe not, was the bright yellow luminous one with the red shorts, for obvious reasons. But you in that kit is quite symbolic, I think.
That was, that period of time was, it was probably the happiest time for not only myself but a lot of people. And that shirt, like you said, it was, everything about it was happy. We had some really tough times, but everybody always kind of mucked together. Yeah. And I'm not just talking about the team, because we had a great manager in Harry. I'm not talking about the squad. I'm talking about the club, and I'm talking about the fans. And we all kind of came together. And that whatever it was a tough period, we all stuck together. And it's different now. Everybody's got an opinion about what should be right, what should be wrong. But in those days, it was about having that resilience as a group, as a tribe. That I think now is very much kind of, because we have so many opinions and everything's being debated. You don't have that togetherness. There's so many kind of shards and splinters of people who are putting different things in people's heads about how things should be. You're not looking at what true leadership represents. And that for me is a big thing, in my life, looking at it now. And if I look back, leadership is so important, because the fish rots from the head. You don't, anything that happens down here, you can slap it away. But if you show strong leadership, then straight away that sets the precedent for what is ahead.
That's really interesting. When you go back, can you remember the first day you walked through the door here when you came to sign? I'm sure you can.
Yeah, of course I can. There was
What were you walking into then?
Well, I mean, what happened was I'd gone to, I was at Doncaster, and we got relegated, and it was Dave Mackay had come in, Dave Cusack had got sacked, and finished that season in what is now League One, and I was 20 when I started, and I'd scored 10 goals. We'd scored 40 goals. We talk about stats, but and I felt that, you know, I'd actually done okay in a struggling team, and when Dave Mackay came in, it was, you know, you very much had the kind of, he very much had the kind of mentality of, you know, I'm the man, and, you know, you will do as you are taught. And I was like, okay, well, my contract's finishing, and when it came up, you know, I went and I saw him, and I'd kind of made my mind up that I didn't want to stay any longer. You know, I didn't want to go into the division below because I felt that I could do a job in this division. And when he told me what my actual I'll never forget, because I asked him, because I knew that one of the other lads who was younger than me had agreed his terms, and when I asked him, he went, no, and I went, okay, fair enough. So I just thought, I can't play here any longer. And but I loved Doncaster, it was brilliant, but coming through I remember it was actually Dave Cusack who brought me down here. Dave Cusack, you know, I kind of summarised my all the people who meant something in my career, especially starting out, and it dawned on me how important Dave had been in my life. And basically, Dave was my first manager. When Billy Bramall left to go to Leeds, Dave took the manager's role.
He was player manager for a bit.
He was player manager, yeah. And he gave me my debut, and I remember we were playing like a game, and apparently I'd elbowed him in the face, and he thought, okay, he's ready, you know. So he put me in, and the thing with Dave was his management was, he was a young manager finding his way, you know, and you know, Billy Bramall had been there. He had you know, you're talking about perhaps players who were not that much younger than himself in some cases, yeah. And you know, then you had myself, Sean Joyce and Paul Holmes, who had come in as the younger players who had just stepped up from what was the Northern Intermediate League then. Steve Bigelow was our manager at the time. Steve's at Leicester now still.
Good bloke, by the way.
Yeah, he's. Yeah, and basically what used to happen was after games, we knew that one of the three of us was going to get it. You know what I mean? What if we lost, that was, you know, yeah. And I remember we played Mansfield and lost 1-0, and I played in that game. I was playing up against George Foster, and you know, after the game, I remember coming off the pitch, and me and Holmes were like, "Who do you think's going to get it?" I went in there, and Dave, you know, he's going around the room, and then you see the eyes come onto you, you know, and he tore into me, and I was like, "What?" I thought, was I that bad? Lost 1-0. And I was distraught after the game, you know. So the next day I went to see him, and I said, "Listen," I said, "Boss," I said, "I don't know what you want from me. I'm not sure if this is for me. I don't really understand." And it was really tough in them days, you know. And he stopped me there and he said, "Look, Brian," he said, after the game, the manager said, "How much do you want for the centre forward?" And Cuss said, "You can't have him." He says, "He's going to the top." And he told me this, and I remember at the time, the kind of, because I was nearly in tears, and he said, "Brian, listen, I'm just trying to prepare you for what you're going to need, you know. It's not nice out there, you know, whether it's the crowds, whether it's physical, you know, you have got to be prepared, because, you know, I believe in you, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the next guy is going to believe in you like I do. Mm. So I'm trying to give you all the tools you need." And it just kind of, it made sense. 100%, and from that moment on, I realised that he was giving us the tools that we needed as young men. And I went into management and it had changed so much. You've got to actually talk everything through now. That was a tough school. And, it was only when I looked back and thought, that's good management, because he knew exactly what I needed, what Sean needed, what Paul needed in order to survive. It might not have been the same for everybody. It might have been different for Paul Raven or somebody else. But knowing what he knew, that's what Brian Deane needed. And it was a good time for me, they call it divine intervention, but I needed to know that at that point, because I was starting to do that in terms of my confidence and so on. So as soon as I saw that, it was like that. And I kept in touch with Dave. And, at the end of the season, he said, well, where do you see yourself, Brian? So I said, well, I think I can do a job in this division. And I says, so what kind of clubs? And I'd seen Sheffield United had just come down. And I said, well, that would be a good place, Sheffield United. And I think the other one was Port Vale. I think Port Vale got relegated at the same time. I might be wrong. But I thought, he said, okay, leave it with me. And my thoughts were, if I can just get into a squad where nobody's going to be thinking about, that want to be going in as a top guy, because I'm only 19, 20 anyway. And it turned out perfectly well. Dave actually brought me in here to talk to Harry. And I remember and it was Dave and my brother, I think. And I remember as soon as I come over the hump and dropped down and I saw the Sheffield United,
You knew then it was for you. Yeah. It was a lump in your throat.
Oh, yeah. Honestly, it's like, how long ago was that now?
88.
So, what's that, 33 years or something?
2008. Yeah. 30 odd years.
Yeah, so, and I came in and I spoke to Harry, and it wasn't even a kind of discussion. He just said, right, this is what we're offering you. And I was just like, I'll play for free. And then Jeff came and he says, Jeff's going to show you around. So we went out and there was Bruce Springsteen concert was going to be on at the Lane. And you guys will know this anyway, So we went out and I looked at the stadium. I thought, wow. I said, I want to be here, This was, and I'd spoken to John Rudge, but again, John Rudge was different to Harry. Harry was like, right, you're coming here. He didn't say it in a way like it was just right. He just assumed that's it. I was coming for talks, and it. He even sort of like said, right, we're going to give you an allowance to move down here. So now it's getting serious. You know what I mean? So all of that and it's like, wow, I'm 20 and I'm going to have to find a house. And it's like, geez, you're moving out of, you're moving, you kind of becoming a man.
Yeah.
And it was great because there was very little I thought there was very little expectancy on me,
You thought you were coming in as a squad player.
Yeah, I did. And then the beauty of that is you come in as the underdog, but I was confident in my ability anyway, and that's how I played it, and it worked really well for me. Derek Dooley was here. Derek seemed to take a shine to me straight away. Tony Garner was here. They were and the squad, the guys here were fantastic. One thing Harry was good at was creating a real sort of like siege mentality, a real brotherly kind of, real environment where you wanted to be. And, it's probably a little bit differently now, things have changed, but no, it was brilliant. It was the only place I wanted to be. And obviously playing in front of the crowds were different to like being down at Doncaster, so it really kind of took off for me. And I think that the time when it really hit home, it wasn't so much the first game of the season when I scored on my debut and so on. It was when I scored the hat-trick that I kind of realised this is like, you know, this is you're here, you can do it.
We're talking about the Chester game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it was a case of, well, you're here, you can do it. You know, it took that, you know, for me to say, right, okay. I still didn't believe I'd made it as a professional footballer. You know, that didn't happen for a while because there's so many things that can happen to you in the meantime. That I was quite grounded because of my family, and yeah. So just going back a little bit, you know, I recently spoke to Dave, and I said to him, Dave's not been very well. And I said, I thanked him, and I said, you know, you're a real reason why, you know, you're a massive reason for me doing what I did, and I only wish I'd have had you as a mentor all the way through my career, because I think there were times in my career that I didn't really believe in myself. You know, there were times when I went down and I was in the England squad, for example, and, you know, I'd go down, I'd meet up, and there'd be people there from Manchester United, Arsenal, Liverpool, wherever. And I was coming from Sheffield United, just one player, you know, and I didn't know anybody. Nobody was particularly friendly. And it, you know, I could have done with somebody who'd played the game and said, look, Brian, you're as good as any of these. These were all things that I had to learn, and it perhaps held me back. There was a strain to me that I felt that there was a time when I felt I could have done anything. You know, when I stepped out onto the pitch, I felt I could do anything. And you know, there was games where I'd act through it on a Friday night, and I knew I was going to score, and I knew what I was going to do, and I'd just be planting things where I'd say, right, okay, in the game you're going to do this, and I'd use it as a tick list. And it was weird, really weird, and that's the thing for me with being associated with the club. You know, whenever I go out there and I smell the grass, it's like, you know, it's like I know every blade of grass on the pitch. You know, and it's always been a very special place for me. You know, I mean, everybody knows that I'm very close with Mick Rooker, you know, and you know, Mick's just retired, but you know, Mick was there on my first day, you know, and I, you know, even when I left the club for a long time, there was a huge picture of me downstairs, and it was like Mick was like a Rottweiler. You know, you know, and it's, you know, the club was a real kind of family. It was, you know, it had the essence of the spirit of the people. Yeah. You know, and that's why it was always really good to come back. You know, when I left here and I went to Leeds, and I went there for 4 years, and of course I scored on my return game, and I'll never forget, like, you know, I went up, and when I was at Leeds we had a corner, and I used to, you know, I'd look up it, because I remember when I was playing for the Blades and we had a corner, you know, I'd look into the crowd and people were like, come on Dino, you know, I'd be like, okay. And then I remember looking up in the crowd when I had a Leeds shirt on, and the hate was there, you know. It was like, you fucking, you know, and I was like, shit, this is real, you know what I mean? And so when my 4 years was up at Leeds, and I had a mixed time there, you know, it was tough for me at first, and then the second season I said, right, okay, I'm just going to go back to being Brian. You know, I don't care about anybody else. If anybody tries to undermine me, whatever, remember what happened. Remember what made Brian Deane. You know, I'd had an argument with my brother, and he said, you know, Brian, you need to save some of that up for some of them teammates of yours. And that made me think. And it made me realise, nobody's ever going to use me in that way again, in terms of how I felt I'd been manipulated at times. It was a different style of football and I didn't get any help. I don't think tactically I got any help because I was used to playing on the half turn, and there I was just a bounce board like Lee Chapman for the first year, and you wait, I don't care what anybody says. It doesn't matter how much you cost, you still need to be developed. You need to be developed by people who understand football, not just be left alone. You need that kind of emotion that you can go to a person and say, I've got this. I understand what you're going through. We'll go through it together. And I don't think there's enough of that. I think that we find ourselves in a position, and it's typical of clubs where they think, you know what, we've paid a lot of money for this guy, just go out and do it. There's always a percentage more you can get out of a player by understanding their character, and helping to develop other sides of the game, and finding out what ticks the boxes. Just for example, when I was at Leeds and going through a hard time, we'd do crossing and shooting, and if you're having a hard time and you've not scored for a while, it's tough because you might have a defender who's going up and he's rattling it into the back of the net, and you are, you're not feeling confident enough. And it's people recognising that kind of thing instead of ridiculing, because I think, it's like when you're at school, kids can be cruel, and it never leaves you when you're playing professional football. People expect you to be, robust and resilient, but if you know which buttons to press, you can have somebody on the floor. And it's no different when it comes to coaching and understanding players, and what gets them up, what gets them down. These are all important factors for me when it comes to either building a squad or, getting that kind of siege mentality. Look, we could be talking about life here. We could be talking about, what it's like working for Barclays down the road or whatever. It's the same. We're all humans. We all have the same kind of emotions. It's just how we change the levels.
Memory test time.
Go on,
Kev.
Yeah, I'm going to take you back to that.
A bit of trivia for you.
Yeah, take you back to that when you just arrived. We talked about that when you came through the door.
Yeah.
First ever game in a Sheffield United shirt, friendly.
Was it Scarborough?
Close.
Wasn't Lincoln. It's one of them places down there.
You're going that way, yeah. You're in the right.
Wasn't Lincoln. Where did we always used to go?
That's it. You bang on. It's a seaside town.
Not Skegness.
Yeah.
Was it?
Yeah, Skegness. Yeah.
All right. Okay.
181. Did you score?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. You got one. Paul Williams 2, Tony Garner 2, and a trainee called Ashley Fennick 2, and an own goal. 181.
Okay.
First league game. So this is interesting to me. You said you came in. You thought you was coming in as a squad player, but you went in there from the start. I don't think Harry saw you as a squad player. Is that about right?
I don't know. I mean, I think Tony Garner was here. Francis Joseph was here. And I just felt that, I'm just this 20-year-old kid. I didn't know what was, I didn't even understand what my attributes were. And I knew I was quick, but, this was a guy who was moulding me into being basically a weapon in a nice way. But I don't know. I mean, it was red in a way, and I stepped onto the pitch. Big centre back, and
so two of those three strikers, you included, got a shirt, and you were one of those.
Yeah.
And it was Tony that missed out.
Yeah.
So obviously they must have felt plenty about you, Harry, Jeff Taylor, and everybody.
But I'd been scoring in pre-season, so I think they obviously thought, well, but they were both left-footed as well. So you're not going to play 2 left footers. You know, if you think about, as weird as it sounds, you know, if you look at having a team that plays high tempo football, okay, is a bit of football inside knowledge for you. Okay, you don't play left footers on the right and right foot. You know, if you're playing possession football, you play people in areas where they're going to come off the line, for example, and outnumber the opposition. But if you're talking about pure pace, you're talking about people who are running naturally down one side or the other. You know, so we had it where you had a left footer and a right footer. Naturally, if you're going down the left, that would be where the left footer would go, so Tony Agana. On the right, that would be me. I'm fortunate that I used to practice a lot when I was a kid with both feet, so I could do either. And so that's, you know, so coming back to the symmetry of a team makeup, you know, when the ball comes, you see it now. You know, if you have a let's say you play 5-3 at the back, but you play a right footer on the left hand side, the right footer will naturally want to come back onto his right foot, which means that you can't play high tempo because he's not going to be comfortable playing balls there, or playing balls in. He's going to be comfortable playing balls inside, but that's where you're going into traffic.
Yeah, that's definitely where Chris has learnt it from Harry, then, hasn't he?
Possibly, but you know, so if you look at even that the side that they play now, you know, the 3, it's like it's a mirror, isn't it? You know, the 3 in the middle, they have different attributes. Yeah. But then you have, if you're looking at the squad now, you know, when they were successful, it was because McGoldrick would drop in and they'd flood the midfield, overload the midfield, and they would have the advantage. But then obviously the caveat to that is that there wasn't a goal scorer. Yeah. So, you know, so that's probably where it's unravelled. But yeah, that was how it was, you know, and I think looking back then, it was a case of right footers on the right, left footers on the left. You know, and Jock used to play on the left, but he could do the same. You know, so sometimes Jock would come back on his right foot and put it in. And the good thing about that was that we used to work a lot with Jeff Taylor on, you know, your runs into the box. And we always used to talk about these V runs. Well, they weren't V runs, they were like a chevron. But like you'd kind of work away from the ball to take the defender to open up the space in front, you know? And then you get back across him. And those guys were brilliant. You know, Jeff, and, you know, it might have only seemed quite basic, but it was fantastic, and nobody really cottoned on. You know, Jeff and Harry were brilliant when it came to set pieces. You know, we some of the set pieces, I've seen some of the set pieces that we worked on still being used now. And, you know, and that's how advanced those guys were. You know, we had Frenchie. Frenchie was, you know, it was all, like I say, it was all the team. You know, Frenchie was somebody who, you know, he was like the guy who everybody took the mickey out of. You know what I mean? And you needed that. You needed him to have his personality where he knew that he was funny, but also he could be a father figure as well. You know, so it was.
We talk in football about sliding doors moments,
yeah,
and doors opening and doors closing, all that kind of thing. And talking about the Reading game,
yeah,
Francis Joseph started, didn't he?
He
It
did
didn't
his
last
hamstring.
very long.
Yeah, that's right. He did his hamstring.
So Tony Agana then comes in.
Yeah, and it just clicked.
Never looked back.
Yeah.
What was it about that partnership, that relationship between you two that made it so effective?
I think it comes back to what I was saying about the mirror. Yeah. You know, where, you know, there was things to my game that weren't brilliant at the time, and I was still developing, and the same with Tony. So it's like when I went out wide and crossed the ball, and I knew what kind of service I would want, so that's what I would do, and I think Tony did the same. You know, we were fortunate that we had Ian Bryson with chipping in with goals as well, but that was a thing, you know. And I think because Tony was a few years older than me.
Did you look up to him?
Yeah,
to start with, yeah.
Massively. And the reason why I looked up to him was because he had such a calm persona. and he's a very intelligent guy, and he just seemed to think it wasn't competition, it was a genuine kind of right, I'll help you type thing, you know what I mean? And you know, it's difficult for a young lad to come in and he doesn't understand sort of like a group mentality in a room. But the way how everybody was great. You know, everybody kind of understood me, they accepted me. But Tony, I mean, even just to give you an idea, when we both scored hat-tricks, you know, Tony let me have the ball. Do you know what I mean? So that tells you about the guy. Do you know what I mean? And he's still a good friend. You know, he's one of the few people I go to for knowledge. You know, when I'm talking knowledge, I mean I'm talking from my football, where you know, on a level where I think, okay, just like my brother, and then there's Tony. You know, those are the guys who are kind of, they'll give you that. It's like that kind of grasshopper type thing. You know what I mean? He's a brilliant guy. You know.
Did you hit that? Sorry, Paul. Did you hit that off straight away with him? That friendship, that you mates early doors?
We didn't. Not initially. It was me and Cliff Powell. You know, me and Cliffy, like we come in, we loved the same music. It was all like the R&B, the Roses Are Red by the Mac Band, and all of these things. You know, and we like Salt and Pepper, Push It, and all of that. And you know, and then there was some sort of like jazz funk stuff that I sort of like in my youth, and Clifford had in his youth. So we were like, you know, when I remember we got on the coach to go somewhere, and we were like, oh, have you heard this song? They had like pirate radio stations in Leeds, and I'd tape them and bring them in. I was like, yeah, check this out, you know what I mean? So it was, so yeah. But Tony and Tufty were quite close. So we kind of, it was like, it was me and Cliff, you know, Cliff's partner at the time, Adrian, you know, so like that was my kind of, you know, but as the games got on, you know, it became, you know, better, you know, mine and Tony's relationship was, you know, Tony was just like one of the senior members of the squad, but, you know, he became somebody who I could go to and you know, for help and advice and so on.
30 goals each, I think you got.
Yeah.
One season. That just doesn't happen now, does it?
No.
In this day and age, that does not happen. No. You're lucky if you get one striker who can get somewhere near that.
Yeah.
But to have two strikers, 30 goals apiece, that's not bad going, is it?
That's because the team play to our strengths, and you know, football for me now is quite sanitized. You know, everybody wants to play a certain way. Yeah. You know, everybody wants to. It's like having a poor man's. Everybody's happy having a poor man's Man City side. You know, everybody wants to play like Man City. You know, because that's what the paying public think is good to watch. But back in our day, you know, people didn't like playing against pace, and they didn't like to play against physical. They didn't like it when you turned the defenders and you played in between them or down the sides of them. But you know, we've become quite controlled. And I remember we used to get a lot of negative publicity from journalists and so on because they didn't. It was like, oh, you know, the hoof. But you know, listen, some of the stuff that we used to. I mean, you'd kill for that now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Nobody wants to go in the box now. Nobody wants to cross and get across a defender, and you know create a situation. Nobody wants to actually, you know, have a. You remember the goal I scored against Port Vale, where all the Leicester.
Yeah.
You know, it's like pinball. You don't see things like that no more because everybody's more concerned with the beautiful. You know, everybody wants to look good on their Instagram feed or whatever. You know, I can't be doing with this. You know, there's a time and a place for everything. You know, there's a time and a place for doing your hair. There's a time and a place for looking good, for if you're going out on the town and you're thinking, I want to, you know, but that's business, man. And I don't, you know, this is one of the reasons why I get turned off now, because men's football is a man's game. You know, if back in the day, if somebody kicked me from behind or whatever, there was no rolling around. I'm going to come back for you. And I learnt that. Not necessarily, I'm not saying I'm going to cut somebody in half, but I'm saying, okay, that's how you want it.
Yeah.
You know, a good example was Nicky Marker when we played and I got sent off. But that was a case of he just kept coming through the back of me, and I'd had enough. Do you know what I mean? And but sometimes you have to put a marker down, because if you don't stand up to bullies, you get a reputation. And I found out years later, people will have an opinion of you from your last 6 games, So I remember when I was at Leeds, I won't say who it was, but I remember playing against somebody and I had a really poor game, and the manager came in and he said, he gets an England call-up off you. And I said to myself, no one's going to do that again. Nobody is going to do that again. If you play against me, whether it's I'm going to be physically stronger or I'm going to be quicker or I'm going to score or whatever, and you come out on top, I'll respect you for the rest of your life if you do that. And that's being a man. And I'm not kind of trying to preach, but I'm saying there's an obligation, as a footballer, the people who come and watch the games, they work hard. They don't, they want to see what it's like their hard work. They want to kick back and put up and open a beer and say, right, okay, I've had a hard week. I want something to get me up for next week. My brothers once said, when I was at Middlesbrough, I was having a tough time, and I remember some of the games I'd go up there and I was sat in the back of the car. It was my car and my brothers would be in front, and I'd be like in the back thinking, jeez, because I wasn't very, I was having a bad time at one time. When I say a bad time, I meant I wasn't playing badly, but I wasn't scoring. And if you're a goal scorer, if you're not scoring, it will eventually get you. But I remember my brother said to me one time, he said, Brian, listen, we work hard all week and we come up, we support you, and you'd like this before a game. How do you think we feel? Do you know what I mean? You got to give us something. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? And it's a responsibility. It's football is a small window into what the wider society is all about. In that, everything that happens here happens on a grander scale out there. People talk about things like what happens with agents and this and that and what have you. Well, that happens in big business as well, what I'm talking about. But there is a real duty, I think, to enjoy what you're doing. And you only enjoy what you're doing if you feel as though it's like the scene in Gladiator when it goes, are you not entertained? It is that. That is what it was like coming off and getting the adulation of the crowd. It was, yeah. Are you not entertained? And when you saw the crowd, I can look back and it was really special down here. And I used to see people clapping as we were coming off, and it's been like that for the last 4 or 5 years. But just from my point of view, and then you'd see people out, and there were people like, oh, I've had people come up and say those were the best years, and da 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 da, and it's a real privilege to be a professional footballer. And even now while I'm talking, some of the thought process coming back now, it doesn't get better than being a professional footballer.
How did you deal with fame, Brian? Because you had the success with the promotions, then the Premier League comes in, and overnight you become superstars. And looking back on that period, I can't remember very often you doing much in the way of media interviews. I might have got that wrong.
No.
Did you get stung somewhere along the line?
Yeah, I didn't really trust the media because I felt that whatever I said would be manipulated, and not a lot of players felt that they were comfortable with media.
Was that a sign of the times?
I think what it was that journalists needed to stay comfortable with managers. So they would change the narrative to basically fit into what was going to be best in that situation. And what it did was it drove, I didn't feel comfortable doing stuff. And even when I went to Leicester, there was an incident where, and Leeds as well, there was a couple of things that I remember. One was where we played at Leeds, and I think it was when I scored 4 goals for them. And the question that I got from the journalist was like, what? It kind of trashed me. I thought you know what I mean? And this is live on camera, so I cut, and you're like, where's that come from? And there was a similar situation that at Leicester when we played Preston, and we beat them 2-1 or 2-0, and I scored both goals on a Friday night. And instead of saying, I'd struggled all week because I had to have an injection before the game, and then the first thing that the journalist says to me is, oh, well, the manager said that you've not really trained well all week and he was thinking about dropping you. And I'm like, for fuck's sake. Do you know what I mean? Do they actually understand? I'm looking at my toe before the game when they've injected it and it's like swelling up. And I'm like, and I'm thinking, this is for somebody else. It's not for me. Do you know what I mean? This is somebody else's party. And I'm just sort of like playing a role, and like that should have been about me. Yeah. And even going back, to when I first came, there was certain, my mum kept a lot of my cuttings, and I look at some of those cuttings and I couldn't even tell you what some of them said because it was wrong, and don't get me wrong, it wasn't all like that, but I look at it and I think, it wasn't just me here or whatever, but you can see that people have to, people need. So when I, there were times where people would say, "Oh, will you speak to the?" No, don't want to do it. Don't trust you. You know what I mean? Simple.
I know, because I in my previous role at Radio Sheffield, and I know we worked together, we did a few games together, but there was a period I remember where I'd pick the phone up and I thought, I've not tried him for a while, I'll try him again, and you politely declined. And I thought, that's interesting. And that disappointed me because you were my hero growing up.
Wasn't anything personal.
No, I know that. I get that. Don't get me wrong, I get that. And I thought, well, that's a real shame because I would love to get this guy's thoughts on A, B, C, D, because you had such a great career, you're revered down here. Yeah. And I thought then, something's happened. Yeah. Something's definitely happened.
To take it further, anybody who remembers, we played Man City down here on Sky, and we drew 1-1, and I scored a goal where, it was a long ball, John Pemberton to Carl Bradshaw, headed it down, and I half-volleyed it from outside the box. I sound like Superman, don't I? But you can actually go and watch it if you want. And I didn't celebrate. Don't know if it... And Andy Gray said, if I'd have scored a goal like that, I'd have... And that was because I was getting baited in the press. And basically what was happening was there were people... I'm not saying who, but... I was coming to the end of that season, and it was like people were trying to make me look like the bad guy, and I'd had enough, and that was it for me. You know what I mean? That was me saying, I'm done, because like I could hear people in the crowd having a go. If we didn't score, it was about me lack of form, and I thought, what do you want? You know what I mean? Coming back to the are you entertained thing. You know what I mean? I just thought, I can't, what am I going to do? What more can I do? I can't just keep taking hits. And it was because there was this insidious campaign going on where I felt that whatever I do is not good enough. And some of it was down to the fact that, there was things happening within the club. There was budgets and all the rest of it, and we were getting to a point where the club was going to have real struggles. And I just felt, why am I taking the blame for any of this? Nothing to do with me. I'm just going out there and trying to do my job. But my job was getting harder every week.
Was that the media stuff? Was that tough on you? There were agendas floating around and people were saying different things all over the place. Was you too young to take on that because you were just a footballer?
No, it was intense, but I think that look, it was just to be expected. I was quite resilient. I had to be, but just on that, it was just the case of I'd had enough. They couldn't. When we talk about manipulation, right, and who's a good player, who's a bad player, I used to see all that. I used to go down to England, right, and you'd see the journalists being cosy with certain players, and there's this run from a club, we don't need to speak to him. Yeah. We don't need to get to know him because he's not gonna, when you went out, it's like the thing with John Barnes, when John Barnes used to get terrible stick. And I remember I was on a bench for a game and I could hear the fans around Wembley, round where we were. And that must have been an impossible job for Graham Taylor, because he was like, he was a genuine guy. And he didn't want to fight the press, but he wanted to do it his way. But you just felt that this was always, they wanted who they wanted in the team. And they used to talk about a north-south divide and all of this kind of stuff. But I remember it was that bad with Barnsley in this particular game that I thought. I remember one time Graham Taylor kind of looked behind and I went, you don't want him to make eye contact, because if he'd have said to me, go and play, I'm like, no, I don't want to go out there. And that's sad.
It is very.
It's sad. But that's how vitriolic things can get with the press, because they have the power, to kind of manipulate however they want. And we see it in wider society, don't we?
Have you learned how to use the press or embrace the press a little bit more in later life? You sat here doing this now. You've done other stuff.
You know what? From my point of view, I'm not sort of like somebody who's in the press a lot. And, I don't know why that is. I'm not saying I'm not bitter about it, but I'm real. You know what I mean? I'm sometimes people don't want that. Sometimes, you have the perception of people who on telly, for example, intelligent. And this is the narrative that people want from above. Mm-hmm. So they keep giving you that and giving you it and giving you it. They don't want, and that's because it might be feeding one section of people or one kind of idea, over another idea. If that's the narrative you want, why are you going to get somebody who might be able to challenge it? No, we don't want that. This is what we want. So, it is what it is. It's like, it's funny because it affects you in all kinds of ways. But the fact is I accept it. I went away to Norway and I went away and I thought, right, if I can manage abroad, then I can come back and perhaps, I'll have learned, totally out of my comfort zone. And, I thought, I'm coming back now. I'm ready. I want a chance. I want to speak to people even. I'm not saying that, people have this idea that you come back and, right, okay, I want a job. It wasn't about that. It's about people finding out what your experiences are. I played for Benfica. I played for the biggest team in Portugal. I played for my country. You know what I mean? I played for some of the biggest clubs, you talk about, you look at teams like West Ham getting in the top 4 now and Leicester, who I played for. I played for both of those clubs. Yeah. But I played for Leeds when Leeds were of a higher level, you know. We were qualifying for Europe and so on. You know, I've been down here. You know, all my, you know, everything that I did with England came while I was down here. You know, but sometimes, you know, and I thought, doesn't anybody want to kind of understand, you know, even if it's not, it doesn't you know, have a conversation with people. You know, what are your experiences? And I think it was funny because when I went out to Norway, it was like, and the job got announced, it was like, what? He's a manager? Huh? How did he get away? How did he get away with that without us managing to wreck that? You know, and the BBC came out and they did a piece and they said, oh, did you have to go abroad? And I'm like, listen, make your own mind up. You know, now it doesn't matter whether I'm black, I'm white, or whatever. Have a conversation. You know, don't be narrow-minded. You know, do not kind of have a perception of how things should be because I understand him or I understand him. You know what I mean? That's unfortunately why we have so many issues now because, you know, we take people at the perception. It's like what I said about things like social media. You know, it's about, you know, on Instagram, I've got 3,000 followers. Well, you know what? I'm not posting pictures all the time. You know, if I can find a picture of myself from my playing days, I'll post it. I might get 100 likes, and that's fine with me. I'm not looking to get thousands and that. What's my benefit? I'm like yesterday's news. But where I'm coming from is, when I was a kid, people with knowledge were the older people. Do you know what I mean? As you get older, you have more knowledge and more experience that you want to pass down, you know? And now you hear about leadership and so on and management where it's like they say, well, leave them in a room and let them get on with it and they'll solve the problem. How can you solve a problem if you have no experience in life? You know what I mean? It's crazy. And I see these things happening all around me. And look, what's the point in saying anything? Nobody wants to listen to it anyway, you know. So that's my answer in a long form of why we, you know, with me and being involved. It doesn't matter, you know. I'm kind of somebody who is irrelevant from that point of view, you know.
You'll never be irrelevant down here. And if you ever want any of those Instagram pictures, we've got thousands. Baldy, as a club, Baldy's took thousands of you.
Listen, right, I'm serious on that. You know, it's for my kids.
Mate,
you know what I mean?
We've got all your kids can have them.
They're 6 and 3. Even if it's just on a reel. I mean, it's just, you know what it is? It's my memories for them.
Yeah.
You know, it happened a long time. I was 47 when I became a dad. You know, so, you know, and I did it that way. I didn't even think I was going to, you know, I'd kind of, everything I'd done was dedicated towards my profession. I put that as a priority. You know, I don't know how I'd have coped having to think about anything other than football when I was playing. But, you know, the way how things worked out for me, they worked out how they did. And, you know, I'm grateful for that because I might not have ever had that sensation, you know, and so on. So, look, of course I'd love my kid to follow in my footsteps, but it might not happen. But, you know, it's taught me what, you know, I think I'm old enough now to appreciate what life is about and what's important. You know, we're in the middle of a pandemic now. And the world for me has changed. I'm sorry I've gone off a lot of football for a lot, but the point is that, you know, we need to understand what is important. You know, football's very important. You know, for me, football will always be the most important thing, and I'm grateful to everything that I've had. You know, this club, everything that's happened in my football career, everywhere I've been. But we have to be realistic about what's important, you know, and getting back to some of those values, I think, will help people fall in love with football again.
England?
Yeah,
You've kind of brushed upon it a little bit.
Yeah, because that was a big thing for Sheffield United.
Yeah,
they'd not been a Sheffield United England player for so long. You've told us a little bit about those experiences. Obviously, you was down in New Zealand, wasn't you, when you made your debut?
Yeah.
How big a time for you and your family was that? And was it a little bit of a letdown, saying what you said about when you went away to camps?
No, you know what? I was so proud, and I wanted to do so well. You know, I kind of like I really wanted to, you know, that was my dream. You know what I mean? My dream was playing for my country, being up there and having a continuation from Sheffield United, you know, now competing against your Ian Wrights, your Les Ferdinands, you know, Alan Shearers, Paul Merson, David Hurst, all of these kind of people. But I think I touched on it earlier when I said about Dave Cusack. You know, having that person who was going to reassure me that you've got all the tools, you know, and, you know, don't worry about not having the hype, you know, just get on with it, you know, and you know, your talents will see you through. I suffered from not having that person. I had it in my brother, but because Tony never played professional football to a standard, I think he played for Boston, my brother, but because he'd never played at the level where you're talking about what we're talking about, it's very difficult because I'd superseded him. You know, he could tell me, but he's telling me as a brother, you know. So it was difficult, but that's what I'm saying. I think if I'd have had somebody there who was telling me, Brian, you know, you know, I've been there, I understand, you know, things don't change, but I didn't have it. And so when I went into those situations, a lot of the time, I didn't believe in myself.
You did remarkably well for someone who didn't believe in themselves.
But
it's look at what you've done.
Yeah. But
all those clubs, including here.
But it's true. It's I used to work on scoring goals would give me confidence. You know, so when I came down here, I got off to a great start. You know, and if you think about the fact that I scored 30 goals in that first season, I had bags of confidence. You know, I was like, I had it in abundance, and it was just waiting for me. You know, it was, you know, I took it into the next season, scored in the first goal of the season against West Brom again, and it was just a natural continuation. So for me, everything that I did I was lucky because I never, in those years when I needed to be where it might have damaged me, it didn't. And then it carried on here. I scored all the goals here. And then I went to Leeds, and that first season was very difficult. And it was difficult because they played a different style of football, and I need to understand how to adapt, but I didn't get that. And it was up to me to find out how to adapt. And eventually I did. You know, I came back in the second season. I went and I kind of went back to basics. I did the whole Rocky thing, you know. I went down. I used to go down to Don Valley on my own with Ed Baranowski, and I'd go down. I'd be down there 4 till 6 o'clock. Getting the fast feet lad. All before any of these, you know, Wengers and all of them were about. We were doing all of that. You know, that's how innovative Harry was, because we needed to find any little percentage where we could, you know, get on a level with everybody else, and that's what happened. So when I went down to Leeds, that's what I did. I went down and I started, you know, and it started to work for me. You know, all of a sudden my confidence started coming back. Because it's like an extra piece of body armor, you know. And so I was going into games and I wasn't caring anymore. I was feeling very confident in myself. And eventually what happened, because in that second season, you know, we finished 5th in the first season. And then in the second season, I started to go down there, and everybody could see that my performances were going through the roof, because, you know, I was my body was changing. I was becoming basically, I was becoming somebody who was very difficult to push off the ball. I was quick, I was playing out of position, but I was getting a lot of the ball and having a lot of touches. And then in the end, a lot of the players started coming down to Don Valley with me. And we finished that season like a house on fire. We qualified for Europe. I got player of the season, and it went from there. So as a centre forward, you're very much a confidence player. If you score goals, it's very much something that you measure yourself with, and you'll look at the fixtures that you've got coming up, and you'll go, okay, I might not score in that goal, I might not score in that game, I might get 2 in that game, but like, what are you, 1 in 2, 1 in 3 guy? Okay, so when it starts getting to a 1 in 6, now you got problems. Yeah.
Can we talk about your second spell?
Sure.
And how different the club was then? It was Nigel Spackman, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah.
He came back.
Yeah.
Was it very different when he came back that time? Obviously, there were changes at board level.
Yeah.
Kind of thing going on at the time, as I recall.
I don't know. I mean, for me, I was just happy to come back. I mean, I had an offer to go and play.
Say never go back.
Yeah, but you know what? It's funny because Mick Rooker, Mick told me that the club wanted to sign me, and I had an offer to go abroad. And then Mick came and said, "Oh, they." So I was like, "Really? After what I've done, scoring in front of the cop, running off, and all of this kind of stuff." And I said, "Listen, Brian, they love you down there. They'd love to have you back." And I was like, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yeah." And I thought, Paul Merson had gone to Middlesbrough, and so he dropped out of the Premier League to go to a Division 1 club, as it was then. And I thought, maybe it can work. What's the plan? You know what I mean? And I did, and I was so happy. When I came back, honestly, it was like, wow, I come back, okay, it's not going to look, I don't look as though I'm bottling out of dropping out of the Premier League. This is a real project, and these people are serious, and, so, yeah, I was really up for it. We had a good squad. We were playing good football. Nigel was a good boss to work for. And I felt, yeah, we had a chance, real chance. Jan, there was a bit of rivalry with me and Jan, even though I don't think either of us would admit it. We were both kind of vying to be the top man. And I remember when he scored a goal against Portsmouth, I think it was, where he ran the whole length of the pitch, and I thought, look at that dickhead. You know what I mean? But I thought, yeah, fair enough, good goal. And but yeah, there was that natural rivalry because he wanted to be top man and I wanted to be. I thought, no one's gonna have. This is my home. No one's coming here, and I'm not playing second fiddle to anybody at Bramall Lane. I'm not going to do that. So it drove us on. And Jan was a good finisher and good player. And yeah, it started off really well, and then basically it, a lot of things were going on behind the scenes. There was the fact that the club had, there was it gone public. We all bought shares and all of that kind of stuff. I'm sure I think, a lot of staff lost money and everything. That's for another podcast. But and the people who came in, I don't know. It was. I'd been so, for me it was brilliant because they had all these plans, on the surface, and also, the guy who was my agent he sold it to me as well. Now I'd have come back anyway, but you kind of, for me, you got to always be careful with them people, and there are some good agents out there, but there are some bad ones as well, and. I look back and I think about that side of things. And when I hear people talking about their disdain for agents, I understand why. Because, the one I had, what was going on in them days, it's people think that I understand what it would be like to be a good agent, but what a lot of players don't know is that a lot of agents, and I won't say all of them because there are some good ones out there, a lot of agents are just bothered about what they're getting. You know, it's, you know, I've heard conversations like, listen, as long as just make sure I get my fee. And then they'll go and they'll have the greatest conversations with their players. And the players will, but you know what? The reason why players need agents is because in the first place, the clubs were screwing players. So they've brought it on themselves. They've created this monster because players do need representation. You know what I mean? You know, and it works to a degree if you've got the right people. But, you know, even at the time, I'd used the PFA as well, but that wasn't a good fit either. You know, and like I said, you know, I speak my mind now. If anybody wants to challenge me on anything, I've sat in every I've sat on every chair now, and I'm just telling the truth how I see it. You know, but you know, it was an opportunity for a lot of people, and then I think the best way to put it is that when people thought it was going to unravel, they wanted to run, cut and run, and the opportunity to go and play for Benfica came to me, and I think we'd just been beaten at Sunderland's Stadium of Light, and the day of the game I got told that there was interest, and when I saw what was going on, it kind of frightened me a little bit because I didn't want to spoil my legacy, but I didn't know that the club were going to sell me and Jan on the same day.
I remember that day.
Yeah.
I remember exactly where I was.
Yeah. And
the whole car park by the cinemas. I just pulled up, turned the radio on, and heard it announced on the radio that not only you had gone, but Jan had gone as well.
And it was.
I couldn't believe it. I'm sure Blades fans everywhere.
It was crazy because I was like, what? They sold Jan as well?
Yeah. And
I was like, and it's just, you know what? It's just typical of this club.
You're still brought up to this day.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but you know what I'm saying is this club is a soap opera. Do you know what I mean?
Would we have it any other way?
Well, no, and that's the thing about Blades fans. You know what I mean? It's a roller coaster. You know, it's a roller coaster of a ride. There's emotions everywhere, yeah, it just, I think, you know, this last 4 or 5 years, I think the essence of what the club is about has been recreated by Chris, because what you've got is you've got a club that the fans want a reflection of their lives. They want something to look forward to. They want their theatre of dreams, and that's what they've had. What happens next is up to the club, and you know, there is an opportunity now where they can decide on what structure should be, you know. But I think that you have to understand what the fans want as well. No, Chris is gone now. You know, people, it's over. You know what I mean? If you're the owner or whoever, you know, whatever, you know, you have now got the opportunity to put an infrastructure in place that gives the club a proper long-term legacy. Short, medium, long-term. Allow the fans to understand what's going on so you buy into it. And look, you know, I'll be the first one to say, you know, in terms of what money's been spent on the squad and what have you, you might not get that back. But you have to be realistic now. This is where Sheffield United are. And the most important thing is that when next season comes, they're in a position to compete, you know. You look at Norwich and the infrastructure that they've put in place. You know, when I was at Sarpsborg, we had a sporting director. And, you know, it's not for everybody, and I'm not an advocate of one here either. But I didn't really enjoy working with him because me and him we just didn't like each other, if that makes sense. No, I wouldn't say we didn't like. We respected each other, but my job was hard enough. I thought, in terms of what I needed to do, without having something else there as well. But if you've got the right person, they can help to direct a football. They can help to mould what the club needs to look like. And a club like this needs to understand the fans. It's a Yorkshire club. There's no point having the same DNA as Southampton or Bournemouth, because that's on the coast and the working demographic is different. You have to have that steel. You have to have that kind of mentality of hard work. We'll get there together. You know what I mean? And that has to run through the club, and it has to be not only on the pitch, it's got to be in the staff. It's what this club has, has made this club fantastic. It's, and there's been up times, there's been down times, but, there's a lot to consider now. The club, for me, and I'm an outsider, I'm not employed by anybody or whatever. I'm just saying it's at a real crossroads, and, there has to be strong leadership now. There has to be direction, and there has to be a transparent plan, because the fans will buy into that. You know what I mean? As long as they know where they're going. If you said, right, we're going up to Grays Park for a walk, that's all right, as long as I know where I'm going. You know what I mean?
Interesting times, Ed.
Yep.
Anything else you want to throw in, Kev?
While we're talking about that, let's talk about that
third.
Let's talk about that third period then when he came in.
I'm gonna have to,
Let's talk about that third period.
Yeah. Okay. So third period. So what had happened was, when I was at West Ham, Neil Warnock was ringing me up and saying, "Oh, you're coming? Are you coming? Are you coming?" And I said, "We got a playoff cup final, and then we can talk about it." Anyway, again, I'm speaking to Rooks. So after the playoff final, we lose against Palace at West Ham, and I go to Marbella on a holiday. So Rooks rings me, and he goes, "I thought you were supposed to be coming down here, Dino. Now then." So I've gone, "Why, what's up?" He says, "Well, we just signed Barry Hales." So I'm like, "What? What's a fucking..." Ringing Neil Warnock now, he wouldn't answer his phone. And so I ended up going to Leeds anyway, but that really upset me for obvious reasons, you know what I mean? And then, so when the opportunity to come back came, I'd been in Australia, that was a disaster. I'd gone away at the wrong time of my career, so far away. I'd not really respected where I was in terms of my body. Didn't do a proper pre-season, went out there and it was just a disaster. And I was happy to come back. And I came down here. It was a derby game. And me and Tony went onto the pitch. And I think Kevin had said to Mick, "What's Dino doing now?" And he said, "Oh, he's playing golf or whatever." And he said, "Oh, come and see me on Monday." So I think they had a conversation, and I think at the time the team was doing brilliantly. I think they had what's his name? Steve Cabell was playing exceptionally well, and they had Lee Bromby, Monty, all of these guys were all Morgs. Everybody was doing really well.
Ships was up top, wasn't he?
Yeah, Neil Shipley as well. And it was, I think Kevin just wanted me around as a influence, calming influence and so on. And at the time I was like, well, is Neil Warnock going to want me here after what happened? I was like, because I honestly, it had knocked my joints in, sort of like finding out here's me waiting for a phone call from Neil, and then nothing happened, and then they signed Barry Hales. So anyway, I went and I met Neil at his house in Sheffield and had a chat with him, and got on really well. Really well. I mean, I had these, everybody has this perception about Neil that he's this and he's that, but, during the time here, Stuart McCall was the first team coach, Tony Daly was here, and I think that the team was so well put together. They had everything in that team. It's a good spell, and I just, he said to me, look, you're not going to play a lot, to which I was delighted. And it took me the best part of 3 months to get fit anyway. You know what I mean? So but it was just a case of come and my perception of Neil changed, because he's a very good manager. I'm not saying that he's out on the training pitch every day because everybody knows he's not, but he's the guy who is like the headmaster. When the headmaster comes in your class, everybody straightens up, and he does that, well on a Thursday and a Friday or whatever. And when you talk about management techniques, I mean, I learned a lot from all of my managers, and there are some things that you learn just from understanding things like that. Like it wasn't. If he was there every day of the week, it'd lose its impact. Yeah. So he comes at the business end, and gets involved. And that's what everybody wants to see. We're going into battle, he's here. You know what I mean? So, yeah, that was the end, and I think...
was that the perfect end for you then?
It was, because I got when I came on and against Crystal Palace, and my mum was here. It was just nice to have all the people who as members of my family here. It was fitting for me to be able to finish my career here. Mick said, "Oh, Brian, you can't just finish. You can't just, you go out to Australia. You can't just finish your career there. No, that's not for you." And so I'm grateful that the club allowed me. I didn't contribute as much as I would have liked to.
You played a full 6 minutes in that last game.
Well,
and got man of the match.
That was 5 minutes too much for me. But yeah, no, it was great for me. It was a fitting end. I wouldn't have wanted to have finished my career anywhere else than here. So very, very grateful from that point of view. But I also think that I made a huge contribution to the foundations of the club as well. So we all got something out of it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We could have done another hour or two, but I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, I've got
time.
Yeah, it's yeah.
I've got some very important things going off.
Yeah, I've got to get back. I've got to go and it's in America. They're 5 hours behind, but I've got to go and.
Well, listen, you concentrate on that. But thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And we could have asked you about all manner of things. I hope that people have found that really interesting, because we could have asked you the obvious stuff about scoring against Liverpool and first Premier League goal and all that kind of thing, which is important. I get that, but we've heard you talk about it a lot, so I thought we'd try something a little bit different and touch on certain aspects people haven't heard before.
Yeah, I mean,
so
you know what?
Thank you for being so open with us.
No, that's fine. I mean, the thing for me is that I get asked the same questions all the time.
Has this been a little bit different in that regard? Please make us feel better about ourselves.
No, listen, no. The thing is that, I get asked the same questions all the time. What was that? What was it like scoring the first Premier League goal? What was it like doing this? As a person, I've evolved, and I think it's important that people kind of understand, that I'm more or less still the same person with a few more responsibilities and experiences, and I'm just trying to be a better. I know it sounds corny, but I'm just trying to be a better person every day. And when you've had the kind of experiences that someone like myself has had, you hope that it's it's rubbish if you bottle all of that up. You know, I've spent time with some of the biggest managers. I've played with some of the best players in the world. You know I'm always welcome down here, but it's like I said to you, you know, I get a good access in terms of, you know, I can come here anytime. You know, there's very few clubs. You know, some of the clubs I've played at, one of them down up the road where I'm going back to now, I remember I had a situation where Craig Short had left me some tickets when he was at Blackburn, and they couldn't find them. And I know there was people there looking at me as if to say, "Oh, yeah, he's." I'm thinking, honestly, I'm not really that bothered about watching football games live. I swear, it's usually too cold for me. You know what I mean? And the seats are too cramped. But I can come down here, and the door's always open. Or it was. I've not been down for.
It always is. It always.
But you know, and that's nice because you know I'm not. You know, I'm a servant of the club. You know, for any of the clubs that I played for, I look at it that way. You know, I'm always here. I'm a servant. I'm always grateful to come and do things because you know I've been blessed first of all, but I'm also grateful that I had the opportunities because you know for somebody like me growing up when I did, if it wasn't football, it would be very difficult to get to the top of whatever for different reasons. So being able to be empowered by the gift that God gave me and being able to express myself and to have a good passing of time has been very important to me. You know, and yeah, it can be a bit of a gift and a curse because, you know, you kind of look back and think, well, what, you know, it's all downhill kind of thing from there.
You're always welcome down here, mate.
Yeah.
You can bring your unofficial agent, Mick Rucker, as well.
Brian, thanks ever so much for your time.
Pleasure.
I know you're grateful to the club, but I know all fans are grateful to you for what you gave them, which was many, many hours of happiness watching you score lots and lots of goals. So thank you. Thank you very much indeed, everyone. Brian Deane. That's it. That's as far as we go, but we will be back in the future with more episodes like this. Take care.
They were looking for. Comes in, nobody goes with him until too late.